So first, I thought what we could do is start by talking about your background in any way that you'd like to describe it, and then kind of lead into what I know that you're an engineer by training, and what led you to then consider going into porn. We can maybe start with that, and then we can see how it goes.
Okay, well, I kind of fell into porn. It wasn't, I, I never thought I'd be a porn actress, really. I started in school. I went to school for manufacturing engineering. I worked in aerospace for about 5 years. I did systems testing for optical systems that were space-based. I mean, I did a really specialized job. And then from there, I went into telecom. The economy is very up and down in Southern California, so that was part of it. And part of my departure from aerospace had to do with the fact that my career and my training were so highly specialized that outside of three companies, it's almost useless. So when I was in aerospace, it was the early 2000s, and um, long story short, I decided to go to telecom, which was consumer electronics. I did that for a few years, and I really hated the corporate structure. I think I'm inherently very creative, which engineers should be,
Right.
actually, but the current scientific tech environment doesn't really cultivate that. So I left and I ended up doing AV production and engineering, which I still do.
Okay.
Um, and I ended up working with people who work in mainstream TV and mainstream film, and a lot of those people also work in porn.
Mm.
And so this is happening, and I really still didn't have an interest necessarily in porn. I always liked porn. I've always liked pushing the envelope. I like the things that other people are offended by. I think, inherently because I feel like these types of genres give people a psychological outlet, and I've
Right.
always found that to be important. And throughout the years, I've studied Jungian psychology. I took a certification course in hypnotherapy and hypnosis and NLP and all these different psychological tools because I was interested in how the brain works.
Right.
So I ended up doing production for a company that required I cast models that did kind of erotic nudes. I put up a modeling profile to cast them, and I had some old modeling photos. I'd modeled for a bit back when I was like a late teenager. Um, and so anyway, I had this up, and I started getting all these porn offers. And then it's a small world, so I knew people who were in the industry, and took a few different shoots, and I kind of fell into it.
Of course, there's a stigma to porn, right? So on
Yeah.
the so, and we'll talk, I guess, if you want, about the feminist stuff. So of
Mhm.
course, there's a very staunch group of feminists who argue that, I mean, pornography basically exists simply as a tool of the patriarchy, right? To subjugate and exploit
Yeah.
women and so on. So you've got the feminists who argue that it's all about subjugation and exploitation and so on, and then of course you've
Right.
got other feminists who are of the exact opposite opinion, right? It's liberating, it's empowering, it's demonstrating female agency. And now, of course, I think I know where you fall, but you want to maybe comment a bit about that issue?
Sure, sure. Well, I think that bringing up, the issue of archetype is a perfect way for us to talk about this because if you look at it, and the feminist, the the victimhood feminist, that's
Right.
what I like to call them, the victim feminists, they see everything as subjugation of women. If you look at pornography and you look at what's popular, there's all kinds. There's degradation pornography where the women are tied up and choked and slapped and all that. Now, what's interesting about that is the women who perform it love it. And we can get into that because actually it's been proven feminists tend to have more rape fantasies than other women. Um, but on the other end, you have the women who say, "Oh, it's liberating, it's empowering, and all of this." As a female porn actress, I sit in this in objectivity and neutrality, and I say, okay, well, we are creating a product for that man who may not himself be able to embody that alpha
Right.
and get all the chicks, but for that 10 minutes he gets to feel that way,
Right.
and that's for him psychologically necessary. It's just like the woman who is victimy or marmy or what have you, she gets to read that romance novel and imagine she's a beautiful princess being swept away by Mr. Neurosurgeon that wrestles alligators. It's the same
Right.
thing. It's allowing people to be what they cannot be in real life. Um, I think pornography is empowering as a woman if you come into it empowered and psychologically aware of who you are. I
Right.
think it can be degrading as a woman if you come in and you're not, because it's all about how you hold your space as a performer.
Right. So let's talk. Let's switch now. Transition to, I
Sure.
think, because we have to whenever we talk about porn, sort of
Mhm.
the moral element, right? So
Uh-huh.
of course, you may or may not know this. Are you familiar with the tabula rasa view of the human mind, or the empty slate? So this is the idea from many social scientists.
Oh yeah, I have heard of this. But
Right,
go
okay.
ahead. Uh-huh.
So basically, the idea is that we're born with empty minds, and it's
Mhm.
only through socialization that we
Uh-huh.
learn to be who we are. Now, of course, as somebody who's an evolutionary psychologist, I think that's a bunch of baloney. Of
Yeah.
course, socialization matters. Of course, learning matters. Of course, the environment matters. Nobody contests that. But of
Mhm.
course, we also come with some biological blueprints that are innate
Yes.
and part of our biological heritage. Now, the
Mhm.
reason why I mentioned that is because many of the people who are proponents of the empty slate view of the human mind will
Mhm.
oftentimes propose intervention strategies to kind of unsoil humans. So, for example, if there is a lot of violence against cops from
Mhm.
young males, well, clearly it must be because of video games. And therefore,
Right.
if we eradicate video games, then all men will just kind of hold hands and sing songs together. Uh, if there is a lot of infidelity in marriages and there's a rise in divorces, well, of course, it has to be because of the porn industry. Get rid of the porn industry, and everybody will live in monogamous unions forevermore. Because
Right.
there's a feel good sense to having an intervention strategy that if
Mhm.
only you could identify the villain and eradicate it, then we could move
Mhm.
on. And I think that
Right.
oftentimes when I hear these conversations about porn, people, even though they don't verbalize it in the way that I just did, that's
Mhm.
exactly what they're succumbing to, right? There's
Right.
something just inherently immoral, sinister, evil about
Mhm.
porn that
Yes.
results in all sorts of downstream ill effects. And if we
Mhm.
get rid of it, then everything will be resolved. What's your
Mhm.
view on that? How do you counter that perspective? Just tell me what you think.
Well, I see, and I find this to be a fascinating theory because if you look at human development, and even in Eastern spiritual schools of thought, if you look at the tantric system, you look at the chakra system, and I don't take these to be tangible, but rather metaphoric.
Right,
The base level of the human beingness is the lizard brain. It's the eating and the pooping and all these
right,
basic physiological functions. And right above that is sexuality. And then you get into ideas of ego and power, and you get into ideas of love and trust and tribe, and you get into ideas of self-expression, and then you get into ideas of spirituality, and then then you get into the greater collective unconscious, right?
right,
So they are mistaking something like spirituality, which exists in a space where all these other needs are met,
right,
as being the same thing as sexuality. Sexuality is one of the most primal base urge drives. It's like eating. We are programmed for procreation, and sexuality itself, the demonstration of it, has happened for eons for a reason, because it's just like food and drink and tribe and needing power and needing land and needing water and all of these things. And the more detached they are from it, the more it becomes a disowned piece of their psyche, the stranger it gets. If you
right.
look at cultures that really disown basic human needs, especially places like in Germany and Japan, that's where you see some of the most bizarre fetishes, because everything becomes fetishized when it's disallowed. And when you have societies that are more inclusive of sexuality, allow people a psychosocial sexual output
Right.
or outlet, and an opportunity to kind of discuss and deal with these things, you don't see the fetishes. So, and we see this in Western culture, because children are idolized and idealized, and then when they hit adolescence, we don't know how to deal with their sexuality, so we're
Right.
just going to shut that down and pretend it doesn't exist. Well, guess what happens? Then you have 30-year-old men who are really into mommy milf porn, because they've never resolved
Right.
that. And it's the same thing with the women. It's the daddy complex. You see this because we don't know how to deal with sexuality through maturity
Right.
in our culture. And I think people who are proponents of the blank slate kind of, I mean, they've done, outside of sexuality, they've done experiments where it was the same thing. And you probably know the source of this, but I remember reading the proponents of this blank slate type of psychological ideal. They said, well, children are born so pure and wonderful and precious that if they just don't have teachers, if they have no influence from the outside world, they'll create a wonderful society full of
Right.
sharing and hope. And then what really happened was, I think they had to cut the experiment after several months, because it became Lord of the Flies. They were brutal, and they
Right.
were, they were actually, it was proven that actually they need to be socialized.
Right. right.
And so
Well,
but
and
you know,
socialization, incidentally, I mean, one of the things that people don't understand, they usually pit socialization against biology, whereas
mhm,
in reality, nurture happens in its forms because of nature, right? So
right.
socialization is not something that exists outside of our biology. It typically exists to support biological imperatives. So already when somebody starts talking about is it socialization or is it biology, oftentimes it's the absolutely perfectly wrong question to be posing. I mean, everything ultimately goes down to biology. And that's one of the things that
Right.
I have faced in my scientific work
Mhm,
in trying to introduce evolutionary psychology to the social sciences in general, but in consumer behavior in particular. I have faced a lot of detractors, much less so today than, say, 15
mhm,
years ago. But it's because they don't like the idea that humans are driven by biological imperatives. There, and
mhm,
this is called the human reticence effect. So,
mhm.
so it's okay for biology to be relevant for every other species that exists, right? So
Right.
if you use some evolutionary principle to explain the behavior of the mating behavior of the salamander or the hyena, oh, great work. But if you use that same
Right.
evolutionary principle to explain something about human behavior, then you're a sexist, you're a Nazi, and so on. And it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's not as though our
Right.
sexuality exists somehow outside of our biology.
Right.
And so in a sense, I mean, one of the reasons why I like to write about things that are very much tied to our basic Darwinian drives, like food, like sex, it's because it's not difficult to make the link to Darwinian mechanisms, right?
Right.
I mean, it's all
Right.
about natural selection and sexual selection. I mean, those are the evolutionary processes that drive much of the evolution of any species.
Right.
So when puritanical folks are somehow exhibit disdain towards sexuality, it's quite silly.
Well, it is, and what's fascinating about it is this kind of Puritanism that's coming actually from people who are trying so hard not to be racist or sexist
Right,
or misogynistic or what have you, that they completely negate our role as human animals
right,
in the world. Sexuality, if you, I mean, you go back to Greece and to Rome and to Tibet and to Babylonian culture and on, and we could go to the cradle of civilization
right,
and find examples of sexuality being fetishized and being drawn and being created because it's a natural drive. It's just
right,
like the Egyptians had pictures of food in their
right,
tombs. I mean, this is normal, and the more we pretend it's not, the more we actually create an unsafe environment
right.
for people to discuss these
Well, have
things.
you ever seen some of the findings on which countries are most likely to access on the internet, pornography?
Hmm.
And oftentimes it's the most repressive countries,
Yep.
right? Precisely
Yep.
for the reasons that you said, right? If you don't offer some channel for people to express their sexuality, I mean, they're
Hmm.
going that channel has to be met. And so I'm
Right.
going to find a way to have it met. And so
Right.
and even things like the relationship between violence against women. So, for example, there's less violence against women historically in a place like Sweden that
Hmm.
scores very highly on gender egalitarianism than in
Hmm.
places where the gender roles are much more delineated, let's say in Pakistan.
If you look at, and this is what I find to be so fascinating about anti-porn feminists, if a man is horny and he has access on his computer to pornography and he jerks off and he ejaculates, now his testosterone level drops,
Right,
his propensity for violence drops, his
right,
propensity for rape drops, across the board. So that's what we see, and it actually makes perfect sense from a commonsensical standpoint.
right,
I'm not an evolutionary psychologist or biologist, and it makes perfect
right,
sense, but they I've heard this often. Oh, rape is about power and control. No, war is about power and control.
right,
Rape is about sex,
right,
because the absence of what is rape without sex? It's basically war.
right,
So it's just pure violence. if
right,
i if a man wants to steal your purse, and he steals your purse, but he knocks you down and he rapes you too, well, then he wanted the sex and he wanted the purse.
right.
That's what it tells you. There's otherwise he'd just take the purse. I mean, this is a very, very simple deduction, and I find it to be really kind of a problem that we even have to have these conversations. I thought we would move past this
Right.
with logic.